if you had to give a criticism of Ruto, what would it be? And if you had to, validate something that Raila has done, stands for, or her supporters believe in, what would that be?
Validate something that Raila has done?
Okay, let me give you an example. Let me use Trump as an example. I'm not saying he's the worst, but some people would argue, but you can look at Trump and some people say, no, only racists support Trump. But then others would say, no, there was an actual grievance among blue collar people in parts of the United States that weren't the city, that were ignored. And that's what he was appealing to. So is there something about Raila, his followers, that you can look at and go, well, yeah, I can understand that, but?
Well, I can understand the fact that his supporters do support him because he's implicitly or covertly alluded to the fact of Kikuyu, the Kikuyu tribe being too powerful in the country, and he tapped into a certain resentment of the Kikuyu, who have spread throughout Kenya, who own property in the Rift Valley, who own property at the coast, and there is genuine sort of resentment of people in these regions about the strength of Kikuyu and sort of land ownership in particular.
Is that the ethnicity that both Ruto and Kenyatta are from, or?
So Ruto and Kenyatta are from two different ethnicities. All three of them are from different ethnicities. So the Kikuyu are the ethnicity that Kenyatta comes from.
Okay.
And that's the ethnicity that actually brought Ruto into power this time around, ignoring Uhuru Kenyatta, essentially the guy from the same community. He's done it in a very negative way, and he's exploited that resentment. But I think if there's a positive that is to be gleaned from that, and you're really, really causing me to stretch my imagination.
But here's what I will say though.
It's fine. I can do
this. Though Raila got 48.8% of the votes, right? Like considering
it's 50%.
As is, so that's almost half the country. So whether they're right or wrong, what is it that half the country sees in him?
So I think it's that. I think that he promises them that he is somehow going to bring greater equality. So if there's anything positive to be gleaned from that, it is that I do think that what it did raise is an awareness among the Kikuyu that perhaps there is a need to at least be seen to be willing to share power. And so this time around, what we are seeing is, for the first time ever, there is no presidential candidate from the Kikuyu community. So what has actually happened is that it has led to Uhuru Kenyatta and the Kikuyu people being willing to yield power to other communities. And so Uhuru Kenyatta went out of his way. And if this is something that he did that honestly, even I give him credit for, I don't know how sober or awake he was when doing this. I'm referring to Uhuru Kenyatta. The fact that he yielded power of the most powerful community to essentially one of two communities, to a leader from one of two communities, I think will be a good thing. And it will be, history might be kind to Uhuru Kenyatta for doing that. And Raila Odinga, in his opposition to the Kikuyu, even though it has been very negative and very tribalistic, did create that awareness among the Kikuyu that resentment might, is destabilizing. I do not believe or think that the resentment is fully deserved, because I don't think Raila has created this image of the Kikuyu as powerful as, for example, white people in South Africa, which is just far from the truth. The Kikuyu are not the majority. They are simply a plurality. They are about 20% of the population, if that, maybe less. And so, and they happen to, because of proximity to Nairobi, the Kikuyu come from the region around Nairobi, and they are a farming community. I think a combination of that and the fact that President Kenyatta, I don't really know if President Kenyatta being the first president, being a Kikuyu, has anything to do with it. But anyway, the perception is that it does, or it did.
So I feel like you have a pretty solid understanding of the ethnic politics in Ethiopia. When you compare it to that, is ethnic politics really much of a significant issue in Kenya, or does it look different, the political friction?
It's different and it's similar. So it's different in the sense that there's never been, so even though we've had 4 presidents and 3 of them have been Kikuyu, and only one has been Kalenjin from a different tribe. So that is seen as Kikuyus being in power, but the government has never just had people from one tribe or from the Kikuyu tribe, to be very specific. The government has always had a mixture of people from right across Kenya. And that's what Jomo Kenyatta did. And Jomo Kenyatta also did yield power to Moi, who was from the same community as Ruto. And at the time, actually, Moi comes from an even smaller dialect of from that tribal grouping of a group called the Turgen, who were really not very well known. So we had a president in Moi from a community, from a minority community, as a result of Jomo Kenyatta's doing. And Jomo Kenyatta did ensure to have a great deal of representation in his government. He doesn't get a lot of credit for that. So it's not similar in the way, for example, that the TPLF government had control of Ethiopia and ruled with a certain level of an iron fist. So we've never really had that in Kenya. If anything, the only dictator we've ever had really was Moi, who was from a minority community. And the way he was ousted wasn't with violence, it was constitutionally. It was by pushing for an alteration of the constitution to reduce presidential powers, which he had consolidated around himself as a result of trying to protect himself after the coup attempt by Raila. So, so in that sense, I think that there's always been a certain level of equality in Kenya. So, for example, even though the Kikuyu are the wealthiest and the business owners and have had presidents, from their community, you have other communities that control other areas. So, for example, the Luo people from Raila, they're highly educated. They're all the lawyers. They control education. They control the legal profession. There's a lot of them that are doctors. And so you just have, the media, the biggest bulk, the greatest chunk of people in the media are from Raila's community. So there's a certain. And then, the Kalenjin, as a result of Moi, he empowered the Kalenjin. And he did so at the time unfairly by giving them an unfair advantage. But quite frankly, I look back on that as a positive thing because he really did raise a community that was otherwise somewhat invisible. And so as much as Moi did it in a negative way, it would be so much easier to say positive things about Moi than about Raila. But even though Moi did it so that's an example of something, I guess. Let me see if there's something. I think it's what I said about Raila, the fact that he raised awareness among the Kikuyu of the potential for resentment, even though it was exaggerated. The suggestion that the Kikuyu are as powerful as white South Africans in South Africa and as discriminatory is just not accurate.
See, you did it.
So now, Ruto.
Yeah, what's the, if I mean, he looks presidential charming, like there, the energy is there. But if you had to offer one critique of Ruto, what would it be, or one concern?
Well, he's definitely seen as a bit of a strongman. And I think one of the things that I forgot to mention is that, I don't know if I mentioned in this interview, I don't think I did, is that in 2007, he and Raila were on the same side. And when Raila caused all of this death and destruction in the Rift Valley, where Ruto is from, actually Ruto was his foot soldier in the Rift Valley, where the majority, the greatest bulk of Kikuyus died. And these are the people that have actually now put him in power. And so he is seen as a bit of a strongman. He is seen as somebody who might be uncompromising and who might harbor sort of dictatorial tendencies. I just don't believe it. I mean, even his speeches since winning, that's not what is presented. But the reason that people give that assessment of him is because when he was on Raila's side, he was Raila's foot soldier, where the greatest death actually occurred, and he was seen as the leader, essentially the foot soldier, Raila's foot soldier in that. The thing that happened and the reason why the Kikuyu have actually gone ahead and ignored their president or the president and supported Ruto on this occasion is because Ruto, via the traditional council of elders of his community, along with the traditional council of elders in the Kikuyu community, actually made amends and came together in a traditional ceremony, peacemaking and reconciliation ceremony, where there was a vow that there would never be violence again between the two communities, which is what led to Ruto and Kenyatta being on the same side, in Jubilee, that led to them being president and deputy president. So he is seen as a bit of a strongman. I'm not convinced that that is his personality. I do think that anybody who associates themselves with Raila turns into, gets infected with this rabid, sort of vitriolic, hateful, tribal politics that is Raila's staple. And I think Ruto fell under that spell. And what we see now, I honestly believe, is Ruto being the real Ruto. He expressed real remorse. He has made not only overtures, everything he has done since that peace pact has been the exact opposite of what Raila has always done. Raila has continued running a tribal campaign, even this season around. He used epithets to describe the Kikuyu that were used in 2007 election that led to the post-election violence. So I think Ruto is seen, I don't see him that way. So I'm still struggling to find a criticism of him, which is really strange because I really, really disliked him back then when, after this post-election violence. And even during the first administration, I had not been sold onto him. Can I really think objectively of something that I think of him that is, I think his, I don't know, he's definitely, I mean, he's president now. I was going to say his ambition, he's very ambitious, and that has obviously rubbed shoulders the wrong way. And I think I think he's willing. I don't know. I'm struggling with this one. I'm really, really struggling with this one.
No, I think you gave us a little more context. That's just sort of what I was looking for. Two quick questions. I'm sorry to turn it back on the horn since people are asking. I just want to get a sense, since you're here, and I can't answer this for them. Where does Kenya in general stand with TPLF and with the Nile River dispute?
This is a tricky one. And are you referring to the Nile River dispute in terms of with Egypt and Ethiopia, or in the Lower Nile? Well, what do we call the Lower Nile?
Yes. So Eddie says, can you ask him what the stand of Kenya on the Nile River dispute and Kenya's relationship with Egypt and the Middle East? So my guess is it's between the dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt.
I think that Kenya, and not just Ruto, I think Kenya's stand is that Ethiopia has a right to harness the power of the Nile. We would argue the same because the Nile does begin in Lake Victoria and runs right along Kenya. And so I would find it difficult to believe that any Kenyan president would argue that Egypt has a right to protest people using the river that runs through our continent and our lands in ways that are beneficial. And I'm not convinced that Egypt has a legitimate concerns. I mean, if the primary use of the dam, the GERD, is electricity primarily, that means that that water continues moving anyway, right? It's not being sort of diverted. It's simply being held in the dam to power turbines, electricity producing turbines. And I would imagine that Ruto talks a lot about dams, and he would be loath to be prevented from using a river source to harness its power for the benefit of the Kenyan people. So I would be very surprised if he took the side of Egypt. And, Egypt isn't our neighbor. Ethiopia is. So I would hope that Kenyans like me would push for that stance. And Egypt has been a relatively destabilizing, not relatively, has been a destabilizing force, right? And sort of seems to want to align themselves more with Europe and or the Middle East more than with the rest of Africa. So our allies are in Africa. I would want to see a whole full Pan-African family in unity, including North Africa. But the North Africans, quite frankly, are the weakest link in Pan-Africanism. They haven't been as they haven't made as strong of overtures, except maybe Algeria. I think Algeria is positively, Pan-Africanist in its approach. Egypt has, at least I'll put it this way: the current Egyptian president seems to be more than willing to be used as a puppet by the West.
Right, it seems so. What about TPLF? Any sense of where Kenya stands on that?
Honestly, I don't know. I feel like
I'll throw this in there. I remember there was a time in the last year that I don't know what her position was. It was a woman. She was top in.
It was the Minister of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, right?
Yes. While Blinken was there, Ethiopia came up and she said, "We believe that they have the capacity to solve their own problems." So that was a positive indication in terms of support for the Ethiopian government versus the TPLF rebels. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there to see if it jogged any memory.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to believe that is Kenya's position. And as I said earlier, I find it difficult to expect that any of the, definitely not Ruto, maybe Raila would go with the Western perspective on this, but Ruto is more likely to say, listen, we have a president in Ethiopia who, president and prime minister, but primarily Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, who is more than capable and who has been handling, which was Uhuru's stand positively, and that minister, was expressing the stand of the Uhuru government, and so I would imagine that would be the stance that Ruto would also pursue. If anybody would be used by the West to sort of raise the TPLF, it would be Raila. So quite frankly, I would argue that Ruto is good not only for Kenya but for our relationships with both Farmajo and Abiy Ahmed, and Somalia in general, whether it's under Hassan or under Farmajo. Quite frankly, I think that he's more inclined to. And by the way, Ruto has made overtures to the fact that he's willing to respect the International Court of Justice ruling that Somalia owns the maritime, the disputed maritime territory between Kenya and Somalia, whereas Raila had said that he would dispute it. So Ruto has made all the right noises to suggest that he is more interested in peace than in confrontation, and that he's more interested in making peace with our neighbors than in making overtures to the West. All of these noises that Raila makes, I don't know whether they're off the cuff or whether they're informed overtures to the West, or wanting to make himself be seen as the darling of the West. It's possible that he understands this geopolitics. I honestly struggle to decipher what Raila understands about anything. I don't know if you've ever heard him speak. Like he's barely, he's it's difficult to understand anything he says. He's barely coherent. And so it's so strange that he's the darling of the West. Apparently, like they don't even make any pretenses, when it comes to backing puppets. Like they don't need to be coherent, apparently. They don't need to be eloquent. And Ruto did a PhD while he was deputy president. Like he went to school and did his PhD while he was deputy president. And it wasn't just awarded to him because he was deputy president. He actually failed once, his thesis, and he had to go back and redo it. So it was genuine. And he did his PhD on an environmental topic. So everything that he speaks seems to be authentic in the sense of his level of information and education and understanding of issues around the environment, climate, agriculture, bottom-up economics. There's all this pushback that he's going to be a complete absolute capitalist for no other apparent reason other than the fact that he himself is a billionaire. We all know that FDR in today's dollars was also a billionaire, and he was the person that introduced the most sweeping social safety net across the United States, and by the way, oversaw the advances made by the labor movement. So, a person's wealth has nothing to do with.
One thing that gives me optimism about Ruto, with the limited knowledge I have of him, is that his background is in environment, agriculture. I see
Absolutely
parallels with the Ethiopian prime minister, and just, we've talked about how important these basic things are actually in terms of being able to maintain the country's sovereignty and peace. So that I'm really curious to see how that grows. Also, really quickly, why, and I kind of have an answer, but I want to hear your answer. Why every time the journalists are covering anything anywhere near Kenya, not even in Kenya, but anywhere near Kenya, they're stationed in Nairobi? They'll be in Nairobi and say, over there in Tigray.
I know, right?
Like they won't even have gone in, but Nairobi's always that place that they could do their live shots.
Well, I mean, a lot of them do have headquarters in Nairobi. I think that's the reason. And it's a lot of them live there too, which is quite fascinating on this topic that Reuters really got it so wrong. I mean, these people are so freaking lazy. Like it's so pathetic. Reuters got it so wrong when reporting this just concluded presidential election. They had Raila leading Ruto by like 90%. Like Raila had 40, I think they said 69 million versus Ruto's 6 million. Like Kenya's population is not even 60 million. And they're so lazy. Like they posted this online. And then even after that, they posted another story that was completely just, off, where they're talking about how Raila is ahead. And then right there in the heading, and then right down within the story, they talk about how it was at 26% reporting, and later on in the story they report at that something like 70% reporting or 80% reporting that Ruto was ahead, but they hadn't bothered to change the heading. But I think it's out of laziness. They don't bother to travel into the regions because why would you when you can just say you're in Africa, right? Like, right. I think they recognize that their audiences can't tell the difference. But I'd like to hear from you why that is, because I actually don't know definitively.
It's just as simple as that. I mean, my question, I think just practically speaking, if Kenya is friendly, to foreign journalists, and they have a huge station there, and there's probably relative stability compared to maybe other nearby countries. I don't have an answer that's much different than yours in that sense, but I do wonder, what negative impact that has on Kenya. I mean, it definitely has a negative impact on some of the countries that they report on from a distance, because they're, so I'm just, would there be value in Kenya limiting that but maybe it's getting, you know, a benefit that is actually
Of
ultimately,
course.
you know, does good for the country as well. So I don't know.
Obviously, there's economic benefit to having, people stationed in Kenya, and who would really push journalists? That Kenya isn't going to push journalists to go report from Addis or from Mogadishu, right? Because A, we welcome the hotel tax dollars, right? But B, because it would be treading into territory that government has no business in treading into. But we should call out the journalists. We, the citizens, should call out the journalists. It's so lazy, like to report about Somalia, like as if you could not go and book a hotel in Mogadishu and report from Mogadishu or Addis or from many other cities in Ethiopia or Somalia for that matter, right? That are perfectly safe, perfectly fine, because we know this, because we travel to these places, and there's a lot of, perfectly fine and safe places
Well,
right
you might
across.
accidentally run into the truth if you do that. You know, you spend long enough in the
You
space,
might trip
you
and
might trip over the truth, you know?
right.
Some people
Yeah.
might later have to say, hey, we actually told them all this stuff, but just
Well,
never.
I will tell you one thing. The Kenyan population, Kenyans on Twitter, is a very active Twitter account that essentially seeks to represent, it's the voice of Kenya.
What
But
to that? I'm so curious. I want to get more in those conversations.
yeah, and they do a really good job of calling out Western journalists, and they are calling out Western journalists for their laziness in reporting. And so, this is something that definitely, we should do more of, and that the normal movement should. You know what? I'm so glad we're talking about this, because this is a really good way of inserting messages into the Kenyan sort of Twitter sphere, the Kenyan social media sphere via Kenyans on Twitter. Like, just by tagging Kenyans on Twitter. I mean, who knows?
Good
I
to
tend
know.
to be
No, good to
I,
know.
I tend to be overly optimistic and always see like issues, ending imperialism like tomorrow. So,
I mean,
like
definitely the seeds have been planted, and I think there's a lot of incredible voices that have yet to get their full, you know, exposure. Like I love to see just African journalists, you know, in the diaspora, or they're actually taking interest in the stories of other countries in Africa, even if they don't know a whole lot. I mean, the threshold for, you know, Western journalists, non-African journalists covering any story is so low. They don't have to know the language. They don't have to know the culture. You know, you're saying like, oh, I don't really feel comfortable, you know, commenting so much on Uganda. They feel fine commenting on any
I
country
know,
with a
right?
lot less information. So I absolutely do have faith in folks that are native to the African continent, whether they, you know, live there or not. I think the more that we can get each other's story right, like the less we need to be relying on Western media, and they can actually report on the stories here in the United States, because there's plenty of stories that don't see the light.
Absolutely, right? Like, so one of the stories, one similar situation was where this journalist, like that I was mentioning earlier, who posted this picture that was clearly from a previous, from previous events. Who knows whether it was even from election protests? It was just a random picture of a soldier. Might not even have been Kenyan, who knows? But anyway, it did look
They
like
just
it was
had it in
Kenyan.
their files. It was free.
Right. It was a Kenyan soldier. I'm not convinced that it was. Not only am I not convinced, I know that it was not in Kisumu where she was claiming there was problems. It was actually shot at a different location in closer to Nairobi. And there were no crowds, by the way, on the other side of the soldier. So it really was a write-up looking for a story. And so it got flagged by Kenyans on Twitter. And so I was looking for stories to post underneath her, fake news. And there were all these stories, of course, about, mass shootings, like just being too many in the United States for the media to cover, knifings in London just being so excessive, and all kinds of craziness. January 6th and the crazy, former president, if you can call him that, like going to grab his driver and try and like completely insane. Like we had a madman ruling this country that
Everybody's
that we call home, right? But anyway,
right.
Kenyans on Twitter called it out. And so what I would say to your audience, tag Kenyans on Twitter. It's at KOT, hashtag Kenyans on Twitter, hashtag KOT in stories, especially that pertain to our neighbors that are either affecting our neighbors or either, coming from Kenya and sort of affected, where there's a negative impact because of Kenyans not being aware of certain things. If you tag Kenyans on Twitter, at the very least, the more we do it, it might not pick up immediately, but the more it's done, at some point, I think, that's definitely one way to connect to Kenyans. Kenyans on Twitter is where all Kenyans go to find memes. That's the first thing that they do is make memes, and they're very funny. But
very expressive. It's a cathartic way to express. I did put in the comment section, you guys, at KOT, hashtag KOT. That's a very easy Twitter handle and hashtag to remember. Anything I didn't ask you, Karanja, as far as the elections goes? I know we went into a lot of different places, but I'm not sure if I derailed what you came to talk about.
I honestly don't think that there's anything we didn't cover, because even when you didn't ask it, I threw it in there anyway.
Like the good journalist you are.
It feels quite comprehensive. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm so delighted to be talking about this. I feel like I'm even finding my voice about, being able to talk about Raila Odinga truthfully, because his supporters are so fanatical and rabid, very similar to Trump supporters, such that Kenyans trying to tell the truth about him get silenced by our fellow Kenyans. And so people have really never spoken the truth about him. It's been silenced by the media. The media keeps it on the hush hush. A couple of things that people aren't aware of, like his agents attacked election officials at the headquarters of the tallying center. This isn't covered on local media. It's not covered in international media. They write sort of headings about chaos at the Bomas of Kenya, the center where the tallying was happening, but they don't describe what happened. His chief agent, a well-known lawyer who appears on TV all the time, a senator, punched the IBC commissioner. Like, none of this stuff is covered either by Kenyan media or Western media. So Kenyan media is extremely lazy and extremely pro-West and extremely pro-Raila. And I've never really understood why they would be so pro somebody who's so ineloquent. He's not a good representation of Kenya, who's caused so much death and destruction. And so it's a bit of a mystery, other than it's so obvious that it seems bizarre that would be the case, the simple fact that he's a Western puppet. But I've never really understood how the Western puppet, like you said earlier, like, these things are very subtle and hard. The lines are always very blurry. It's hard to understand them. But it seems bizarre to me that Kenyan media would be so pro this man simply because he's the guy that the West wants. He's never been a good representation, a good representative for Kenya. He's really, really ineloquent. The current Kenyan president, who turned out to be a bit of a dud, is, at the very least, he's really, really eloquent. Like, his speeches, are so well done and so well written. Whenever he doesn't go off the cuff, that is.
Is it Ruto or Uhuru Kenyatta?
Uhuru Kenyatta.
Gotcha.
Ruto is eloquent and well-spoken and very disciplined. So this will be very refreshing. But you will see, I mean, if you pay attention, Kenyan media will be very negative towards him. They always have been. It's very difficult to understand that relationship, other than that Western media has managed to somehow insert, not just Western media, but Western influences in general, like we know the influences, have managed to insert themselves into Kenyan media. I don't know how they've done it. I'd love to do a study on it. To really, it's just a study in.
Media is everything. Like it's everything. It literally forms reality.
It does.
It really does. It creates people's reality. I mean, I'm curious how much money there is from the outside, the so-called West in Kenya media. I mean, it's also subtle. Every time I see, African News Network, Kenyan News Network, Ethiopia, you're just like, who is it actually funded by? And often when you look at it, it's the French government, it's some other country government off the continent, it's some telecom company in wherever, like whatever country that's not, but they have the face that makes it seem like it's from that native country or it's from the African continent. And then they mix in the truth with the lie, so it's just so it's been cooked for a very long time, and I think it's going to take us some time in these sort of conversations to really figure out where the lines are in terms of what's really organic coming from people and what's actually being embedded through all of these different channels.
The thing that makes it difficult for me to understand is that there's little evidence that Kenyan media is heavily invested in by Westerners. It does seem to be owned wholly by Kenyans, but maybe that's just my ignorance. It might not be the case. These
the Kenyans that own the media companies, I'm curious, who are they owned by, or who do they have relationships and business ships with? I mean, sometimes it's not so sinister, it's just that they're in business with people on, the outside. They don't necessarily understand how negative the impact of what they're creating is, because sometimes there's legitimate information. So I'm just curious. I mean, unless the people themselves, right, unless the Kenyan business people themselves are okay with that narrative, but I just doubt it's possible without these seasoned narrative manufacturers.
Well, I will say that the biggest media company that I was describing, Royal Media Services, which we refer to really as Raila Media Services, is owned by a Kenyan billionaire who is a self-made billionaire, quote unquote, as far as we know, and who's a friend of Raila's, and goes back to like the 1960s when they went to school together they didn't go to school together in the United States, but they were friends from really far back. And he supported Raila seemingly purely because they're friends, but his support of Raila is also fanatical and vitriolic. As far as I understand, this man isn't funded by the West. He is a billionaire because of assets earned and acquired in Kenya. Whether they acquired legally and straightforward way, it is not known, but they do seem to be locally acquired. And so his support of Raila makes sense, in that sense that they are friends. But even then, these sort of anti-Kenyan narratives, I think that Kenyan media doesn't recognize them as anti-Kenyan because, of course, it's very fashionable to be against African governments, right? As we said earlier, and Raila has always been the guy who has always opposed government. Now, the thing, of course, is that this time around, he was the government candidate, and the current president made it clear that he was willing to break the law to support Raila. The media never called him out on that, which was just so bizarre. I mean, the media used to be really vitriolically opposed to Uhuru Kenyatta until he became friends with Raila. Like, it's just so bizarre.
That is so interesting. Yeah, it doesn't add up all the way, but then I need to learn so much more. What about Ruto? Are there any media houses or entities that tend to be very favorable towards him beyond just that they may actually like where he comes from? So somebody mentioned both Ruto and Raila own media houses. Is there truth to that?
Raila doesn't actually own any media house. Like he's not organized enough, I think, to own such an entity. Ruto did buy a station called Radio Africa, and that's the only station that puts out any positive stories about him. They're just not very big in Kenya. I've only learned about them very recently, and I don't see any stories from Radio Africa. And that's not to say that other Kenyans aren't seeing stories from them. I simply haven't. I just don't think that they're big enough in Kenya, unless I may be completely misinformed about this. So that's the only one that puts out positive stories and seeks to be, I believe, neutral about, well, not neutral, but reports the news as is, and is supportive of Ruto, of course, because he owns it. But it's nowhere near as big as Raila Media Services that I was talking to you about. Like I said, Citizen TV that is owned by Royal Media Services is second biggest station in Africa.
Is a company that Raila owns?
It's me I'm the one that calls it Raila Media Services.
Okay.
It's actually called Royal Media Services. RMS.
I had a moment. No, I just wanted to clarify if that was what was said. I think people would wonder why I didn't mention it.
Well, Kenyans call it Raila Media Services because it's so blatantly pro Raila, like it's Fox-like in its vitriol, in its support, in its fanatical support for Raila.
A lot of parallels there, but it's so interesting because I feel like right now Fox is like reasonable in some sense in terms of the foreign policy, but we'll I mean they're making sense in a way that like CNN isn't. It's crazy. I'm not necessarily co-signing it, but that's
I mean, obviously we know that they do that simply to oppose the current government, but hey, whatever, like, right? Like if it's doing
at least I mean, whether it's they make so much sense and it's so interesting. But you're right. It's all politics at the end of the day. So I'm not putting too much weight on that. Just last question. What about I know we're young, but I'm talking about like the youth of, in Kenya in terms of how involved are they in all of this? Are they engaged at all in what's going on in politics, or what's the general focus?
So the Raila side ran a sustained campaign to suppress the vote by, via misinformation and disinformation, and these suggestions that A, he was being backed by the deep state, and B, that all politicians are the same, and therefore really, don't worry about what any politician's platform might be, just go vote for the guy that you like. And sort of, with whispers of just vote for the guy who's from the community that you're from, kind of thing. And it worked. It suppressed the vote of the youth. The youth did not register to vote. They're the biggest chunk of the population, and they were not. Their voter registration dropped this time around, and voter turnout dropped quite drastically from the upper 70s, if not 80s% voter turnout to 65% in this election for the first time in over, I think, definitely in over a decade and possibly close to 20 years. I don't remember the exact length, but at a very long time since we had voter turnout in the 60s. I think maybe the times of Moi when, voting meant nothing because, he always won. But this is what they did this time around. They suppressed the vote very successfully with those messages. One thing I will say about Raila, and I think it's because of the assistance that he gets from the International Republican Institute and the CIA and via bodies like that, his side is so effective at communicating. Kind of like the Republicans versus Democrats. Republicans are always very effective in their messaging. They stick to a story. They don't care if it's true or not. They will create a scenario and they will convince you that, this is a plate and, we are calling this a plate from here on, and they'll just stick to it. Raila does that too, very, very effectively. And that is definitely, I believe, something that he gets from his assistants, from the usual suspects,
Very interesting. Okay, I love it. This is also helpful. This is, by the way, way overdue. I guess.
Right? I can't believe we've gone so long.
You know what? And consistent too in terms of the viewership. So it's
Oh, that's good.
yeah, I would have dropped it if the numbers started to drop, but maybe people are coming in and out, but yeah, it stayed pretty consistent. So I think people are engaged. Oh, someone said, "Did you mean Democrats in terms of them being effective in communicating, calling the cup a plate?" Right now is a very weird time in America. So a lot of what you're saying about Republicans also works for Democrats. A lot of what you're saying about Fox News also works for the liberal media. So, but that's a whole other conversation that we will prepare for and have maybe at some point and see what the parallels are and aren't when it comes to what's going on in Kenya. Karanja Gaçuça, thank you so much. You're on Twitter at Karanja, Karanjasan, right?
Correct, at Karanja-san.
Karanja-san. And I put that in the comment section, you guys. So please go follow Karanja on Twitter. Follow Kenya Twitter at KOT, hashtag KOT. And please like and subscribe and hit notify me when we have live segments that are scheduled so that you get the notification. Karanja, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Hamela.
This was so good. So much we can talk about, but we're going to just
I know, right?
And we're going to come back with more. I think a lot of people appreciated all your insights. We needed the Kenyan perspective, and I think we got it today. So thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. Please remember to hit subscribe, and please consider supporting independent journalism by going to patreon.com/HermelaTV and becoming a member. Thank you so much for your support.